Richard the Lionheart, a king, a warrior, and a legend. But who was he really? Was he just a fearless crusader, or a ruler torn between duty and desire? In this video, we'll uncover the real story of Richard I of England, his battles, his triumphs, and the price he paid for glory. If you love epic history stories, make sure to subscribe, drop a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Richard Plantagenet, the man who would one day be remembered as Richard the Lionheart, was in 1757 in Oxford, England. His birth took place during a time of great power struggles and shifting loyalty across medieval Europe. He was the third legitimate son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of her age. Eleanor was no ordinary queen consort. She was a duchess in her own right, the ruler of Aquitaine, and a woman of immense wealth, culture, and ambition. Through her, Richard inherited not only vast lands in France, but also a legacy of independence and pride. From the very beginning, Richard's destiny was shaped not only by England, but also by the sprawling empire his father controlled. But King Henry II ruled over an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, encompassing England, Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, and Aquitaine. This was more than the Kingdom of England. It was the Angevin Empire, one of the most powerful dominions in all of Europe. Yet within this empire, family unity was fragile. The Plantagenets were known as brilliant rulers, but also as quarrelsome, ambitious, and endlessly divided among themselves. Richard did not spend his earliest years in England. Instead, much of his childhood was spent in the south of France, in the Duchy of Aquitaine, his mother's homeland. The culture of Aquitaine was unlike that of England. It was a land of castles perched upon rocky hills, courts filled with music and poetry, and troubadours who sang of love, loyalty, and the ideals of chivalry. Here, Richard grew up surrounded by stories of knights and heroes, of honor and glory. The language of his childhood was not English, but the soft lyrical tongue of the Occitan poets. In his youth, Richard displayed a mixture of refinement and ferocity. He inherited his mother's sharp intelligence and strong will, along with his father's determination and restlessness. From Eleanor, he learned the values of courtly culture, the appreciation of poetry, and the understanding of power as both a matter of politics and image. But alongside this refinement grew his passion for the art of war. By the time he was a teenager, he was already known for his skill with the sword and his commanding presence on horseback. Richard was tall, broad-shouldered, and striking in appearance. Chroniclers described him as a man who looked every bit the warrior prince, strong, handsome, and full of authority. Yet he was not only a figure of strength. He also possessed a fiery temper and a restless ambition that often put him at odds with his father. Like many of his brothers, Richard grew up in a household where loyalty to the king was tested constantly. The Plantagenet princes, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, Richard, and John, each harbored their own ambitions, and under the influence of Eleanor, they would rebel more than once against their father's rule. These family quarrels were more than private disputes. They shaped Richard's character, teaching him from an early age about betrayal, strategy, and the harsh realities of power. He would learn that to survive in such a family meant being both clever and fearless. Conflict was the air he breathed, and in that constant struggle, Richard sharpened his talents as both a warrior and a leader. As a boy, he was also exposed to the rituals of knighthood and the values of chivalry. In Aquitaine, knights were not only warriors, but also symbols of loyalty and culture. Richard absorbed these ideals deeply, and throughout his life, he would embody the image of the perfect knight, bold in battle, loyal to his companions, and ever eager for glory. Troubadours sang of courage and love, And Richard himself learned to compose verse, showing a softer side to his otherwise martial nature. Yet for all the poetry and culture of Aquitaine, it was clear that Richard was destined for a life of conflict. His early years laid the foundation of a man who would become famous not only as a king, but also as a warrior, whose name would echo through the Crusades and the legends of medieval Europe. Strong, proud, and restless, Richard was a prince who carried both the brilliance and the burdens of his lineage. He was not merely the son of Henry and Eleanor. He was a child of two worlds, England and France, poetry and war, loyalty and rebellion. These contradictions would define him for the rest of his life. And so, in the castles of Aquitaine and the shadow of his father's empire, Richard of Plantagenet began his journey toward kingship. He was still only a boy, but already the qualities that would earn him the name Lionheart were taking shape. Richard was born in September of the year 1157, the third legitimate son of King Henry II of England and his formidable queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine. From the very beginning, he was not destined to inherit the crown. His elder brothers, William and Henry, stood ahead of him in the line of succession. But fate, unpredictable as always, would eventually carve out a different path. As a child, Richard grew up not in the misty castles of England, but in the warm, sunlit lands of Aquitaine in southern France. His mother, Eleanor, had once been Queen of France before she married Henry, and she carried with her the refined culture of the troubadours, the poets, and the courts that celebrated chivalry and love. From her, Richard inherited not only his passion for poetry and music, but also a fiery temperament and an unbending pride. He learned to read and write in Latin and Occitan, and though he was never a scholar in the strict sense, he became known for composing verses and even psalms later in life. Eleanor's presence loomed large over Richard's childhood. She was a woman unlike any of her age. Independent, intelligent, and daring. She openly defied her husband, Henry, and often she inspired her sons to rise against him as well. The household of the Plantagenets was not a place of quiet family dinners, but a storm of ambition, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. Richard grew up watching his parents clash, Henry with his iron will and political genius, Eleanor with her cunning and pride. From this battlefield of personalities, the boy absorbed a lesson he would carry all his life. Power was never freely given. It had to be taken. By the age of 12, Richard was already recognized as Duke of Aquitaine, a title given to him not just as an honor, but as a responsibility. In those lands, rebellion simmered constantly, and Richard was expected to keep order. At first, the young prince was guided by his mother and experienced advisors, but soon he began to lead men into real battles. Chroniclers wrote that Richard showed no fear in combat, even as a teenager. His tall stature, commanding voice, and sheer presence earned him respect from hardened knights who would later swear by his courage. But his relationship with his father, King Henry, was far from peaceful. Henry expected obedience from his sons, but Richard inherited Eleanor's pride. Conflicts broke out often, sometimes escalating into open rebellion. Richard joined his brothers in uprisings against their father, fueled both by Eleanor's encouragement and by his own ambition to carve out his authority. Though the revolts were crushed, and though Richard had to kneel and beg his father's forgiveness more than once, he never truly surrendered his independence. In these years, Richard's character solidified. He was no longer a boy, but not yet the crusading king he would become. He was already feared on the battlefield, admired by poets, and mistrusted by his father. The prince had been so fun. Eleanor's guiding hand remained strong, and in him, she saw the son who best carried her own spirit forward. Thus, by the time Richard reached his 20s, he was no ordinary prince waiting for a crown. He was a warrior hike, a poet high knight, and a man whose heart burned with both pride and restless ambition. The temple was hot, he said to a great fever. Sees his father laden flight, most considerable and restrained, but did not. The stage of his early life was set, and soon greater storms would come. Storms that would pit him against his own father and propel him toward a destiny few could have imagined. Richard's childhood in Aquitaine was unlike the sheltered upbringing of many princes. The duchy was a land of towering castles, sun-drenched vineyards, and turbulent politics. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, instilled in him a fierce sense of independence and ambition. She was no ordinary queen. She had been married to the King of France before Henry, and she carried with her a legacy of culture, learning, and defiance. From her, Richard inherited not only intelligence, but also an iron will. From an early age, Richard showed a natural inclination toward command. While his brothers squabbled and sought favor at their father's court, Richard learned to ride, to fight, and to speak the language of both nobles and commoners. The people of Aquitaine admired him, for he possessed a fiery spirit that matched their own. By his early teens, he was already recognized as a skilled knight, tall and broad-shouldered, with striking presence on the battlefield. But Aquitaine was not a peaceful inheritance. It was a land that Richard, still little more than a boy, was thrust into the brutal realities of ruling. He learned how quickly loyalty could turn to treachery, and how vital it was for a ruler to be both respected and feared. In countless skirmishes, he earned a reputation for courage and ruthlessness. Unlike his father, who was a cunning strategist, Richard relied heavily on boldness and sheer willpower. Tensions within the royal family soon began to erupt. King Henry II's vast domains were both a blessing and a curse, for each of his sons desired power of their own. Henry the young king, the eldest, grew resentful of his father's refusal to grant him real authority. Richard and his brothers found themselves drawn into conspiracies, rebellions, and uneasy alliances. More than once, Eleanor herself sided with her sons against her husband, fueling the fires of division. For Richard, these struggles were a proving ground. At 16, he commanded armies against rebel lords in Aquitaine, crushing resistance with ferocity that shocked even seasoned warriors. His soldiers began to call him Occitan's Pride, for he embodied the spirit of the land. Yet his relationship with his father grew increasingly strained. Henry II admired Richard's skill, but mistrusted his ambition. He saw too much of Eleanor's defiant spirit in the boy. Despite the conflict, Richard's fame as a warrior spread. Troubadours sang of his victories, casting him as both a noble knight and a fearsome avenger. He wrote poetry in the language of the South, blending art with arms, showing that he was not only a man of war, but also of culture. This combination of brutality and refinement made him a unique figure among princes of his age. By the time he reached his early 20s, Richard was no longer just the Duke of Aquitaine. He was becoming a legend in his own right. His presence on the battlefield was electrifying. He led from the front, charging into danger with his sword raised high, inspiring his men to follow him without hesitation. Even his enemies began to respect him, for he embodied the chivalric ideal of courage without fear. But beneath the songs and the glory, Richard's heart carried the scars of constant strife. He had fought against rebels, against his own vassals, and even against his own family. Each victory left him more hardened, more determined, yet also more isolated. Trust was a rare currency in his world, and Richard learned to rely only on his sword and his unshakable will. It was in these years that the foundations of the Lionheart were laid. Richard was not merely a king in waiting. He was already shaping the destiny that would make him one of the most celebrated warrior kings in history. The boy who had grown up in Eleanor's court was now a man whose name carried weight across Europe. a name that would soon echo in the Crusades and on the battlefields far beyond Aquitaine. As Richard grew into adulthood, it became clear that he was no ordinary prince. He possessed the tall frame, golden hair, and commanding presence that made people stop and look whenever he entered a hall. Unlike many nobles of his time, he was not only a skilled knight, but also an inspiring leader, someone who could rouse men's spirits with just a few words. Richard was trained from childhood in the art of war, swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the strategies of siege and battle. He excelled in tournaments, where his boldness and sheer strength earned him both admiration and envy. By the time he reached his 20s, Richard had already proven himself a formidable warrior. In his duchy of Aquitaine, rebellious barons often rose up against the authority of the Plantagenet family. But Richard was merciless with his enemies. He crushed castles, burned strongholds, and made it clear that no defiance would be tolerated. His campaigns were brutal, yet effective, cementing his reputation as both a feared and respected ruler. The people whispered that he was like a lion in battle, unyielding, proud, and impossible to tame. It was this image that later gave rise to his legendary title, Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart. But Richard's ambitions extended far beyond Aquitaine and France. In the year 1187, news spread across Europe that shook the Christian world. Jerusalem, the holy city itself, had fallen into the hands of Saladin, the great Muslim leader whose victories had stunned Christendom. The loss of Jerusalem was more than a political defeat. It was seen as a spiritual catastrophe. Kings, nobles, and common folk alike felt that the very heart of their faith had been stolen. Across Europe, the cry went out for a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Richard heard this call and answered it with fiery determination. He had grown up with tales of the First and Second Crusades, hearing how brave knights had carried the cross upon their shoulders and marched into distant lands to fight for God. Now, the chance had come for him to prove himself, not just as a duke or prince, but as a champion of Christendom. He vowed to take the cross, swearing before God and men that he would march to the east and fight until Jerusalem was restored to Christian hands. Yet this decision was not made lightly. Crusading was enormously expensive. Armies had to be raised, ships built, supplies gathered. To fund his expedition, Richard sold lands, titles, and even official positions within his realm. Chroniclers wrote that he would have sold London itself if he could find a buyer. His single-minded focus on financing the crusade showed just how deeply committed he was. Everything, wealth, politics, even the stability of his kingdom, was sacrificed for the holy cause. Meanwhile, Richard's relationship with his father, Henry II, grew increasingly strained. The Plantagenet family was notorious for its rivalries, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Richard, ambitious and independent, often clashed with Henry, who was reluctant to release full power into his son's hands. In their final years together, father and son quarreled bitterly, and Richard even allied himself with Philip II of France, Henry's greatest rival, to force concessions. When Henry died, in the year 1189, Richard inherited the crown of England, though he had spent most of his life in France. His coronation was magnificent, a spectacle of knights, nobles, and churchmen, celebrating the rise of a new king. Yet even as he was crowned, Richard's thoughts were already far from Westminster. He saw himself less as a ruler of England and more as the chosen leader of Christendom's holy army. To Richard, the throne was not an end, but a means, a foundation from which to launch his great crusading venture. The path before him was dangerous, costly, and uncertain, but Richard embraced it with the courage and passion that defined his very being. Thus, The young king stood at the threshold of history, ready to embark on the greatest adventure of his life. England would soon find that their monarch was not a man who ruled from the safety of his palace, but a warrior king whose destiny lay thousands of miles away, beneath the burning sun of the Holy Land. As the great fleet of King Richard set sail from Sicily in the spring of 1191, the Crusaders' spirits were high. The sight of hundreds of ships moving together across the blue waters of the Mediterranean was breathtaking, a moving city of sails, banners, and knights. The journey ahead, however, would prove as dangerous as any battle. Not long after leaving port, storms began to test the Crusaders' resolve. The sea raged with towering waves that crashed over the decks, tearing sails and snapping masts. Many men prayed desperately, believing that God was testing their faith. Among the ships caught in the fury was the vessel carrying Richard's sister, Joan, and his bride-to-be, Berengaria of Navarre. Their ship was driven toward the shores of Cyprus, where danger awaited not only from the sea, but also from men. Cyprus, at that time, was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, a rebellious Greek noble who had declared himself independent from the Byzantine Empire. Known for his cruelty and ambition, Isaac had little love for Western crusaders. When Richard's stranded ships washed upon his shores, he saw an opportunity. He seized the survivors, looted the cargo, and imprisoned those who resisted. Among his captives were women of noble birth, and Isaac planned to use them as leverage. When Richard received news of this betrayal, his fury was immediate. Though his army was exhausted from the storm, the king would not allow such an insult to stand. With fiery determination, he ordered his knights to prepare for battle. The attack on Cyprus was swift and merciless. Richard's men stormed the beaches, scattering Isaac's forces. The king himself rode at the front, his golden lion crest gleaming in the sunlight, his sword flashing with every strike. Witnesses claimed that Richard fought with such ferocity that the enemy's courage crumbled at the mere sight of him. Isaac Komnenos attempted to flee, but Richard pursued him relentlessly. The Cypriot ruler, realizing he could not withstand the might of the English king, finally surrendered. Legend says that Richard, mocking Isaac's pride, promised to treat him with honor, so long as he was not bound with iron chains. True to his word, Richard had golden chains fashioned for his prisoner, turning humiliation into a symbol of his own power. The conquest of Cyprus was more than just vengeance. It became a vital victory for the Crusaders. The island, rich in resources and strategically placed, offered safe harbors and supplies for the long campaign ahead. Richard married Berengaria in Cyprus, making her Queen of England, even though she would never set foot in the land she ruled. Their wedding was celebrated with feasts and music, a brief moment of joy amid the hardships of war. By the time the fleet departed once more, the Crusaders were stronger than ever. They had gained not only provisions and allies, but also the assurance that their king was fearless, decisive, and unyielding in the face of adversity. The road to the Holy Land still stretched far ahead, but Richard's reputation as a warrior and leader was for any desire. His men believed that with such a king, nothing could stand in their way. By the late 12th century, the Third Crusade had reached its most crucial stage. Richard the Lionheart, already celebrated as the greatest warrior of his age, had become both the beating heart and the heavy burden of the Christian campaign. Every decision he made, every command he gave, shaped the destiny of thousands. Yet, with glory came exhaustion, and the Holy Land was still far from secure. After the bloody siege and triumphant capture of Acre, Richard's reputation soared. Soldiers whispered his name with reverence. Enemies trembled at the mention of the Lionheart. But victory came at a great cost. The endless heat, lack of supplies, and constant raids by Saladin's forces tested even the bravest knights. Disease spread through the camps, striking down men faster than swords could. Still, Richard's willpower kept the army moving. The march toward Jerusalem began in high spirits. To the Crusaders, the Holy City was no longer just a destination, it was a vision of divine triumph. Along the route, Richard displayed not only military genius, but also profound discipline. He positioned archers and crossbowmen with precision, ordered strict formations, and punished disorder ruthlessly. Unlike many kings who relied solely on their noble knights, Richard valued the common soldier, understanding that without their endurance, no great city could be taken. Saladin, however, was no ordinary foe. His scouts shadowed Richard's army constantly, striking supply lines, ambushing stragglers, and harassing the Crusaders at every opportunity. Yet time and again, Richard turned the tide. At the Battle of Arsuf, his command proved legendary. When Saladin's cavalry pressed too close, Richard unleashed his knights in a devastating countercharge that shattered the enemy lines. The victory restored the Crusaders' morale and proved that the Lionheart was unmatched on the battlefield. And yet, victory was not enough. The road to Jerusalem stretched on, and with it grew doubt. Supplies dwindled, soldiers weakened, and whispers of despair echoed through the ranks. Richard himself fell gravely ill, suffering from fever that left him unable to ride for days. Still, he refused to abandon his men. From his bed, he issued orders, his voice hoarse but unyielding. His presence alone gave courage where hope faltered. At last, the Crusaders came within sight of Jerusalem. The holy city lay on the horizon, its walls gleaming beneath the sun. It faded, for the second, a young husband-ducker of a range. Soldiers fell to their knees, some weeping, others praying. The dream of generations seemed within reach, but Richard, ever the strategist, hesitated. He knew that to march upon the city without sufficient supplies and reinforcements would be disastrous. Saladin's forces still lingered, ready to cut off retreat and starve the army. In council, Richard faced bitter arguments. Some commanders urged immediate assault, willing to risk everything for the chance to reclaim the city. Others sided with the king, recognizing the danger. Richard's decision was agonizing. The Crusaders would not attack Jerusalem. Instead, they would secure their positions along the coast and preserve their strength. The choice shattered many hearts. Soldiers who had dreamed of kneeling in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now felt betrayed. Whispers of anger spread through the camp. Yet Richard knew the truth. A king must sometimes sacrifice glory to protect his people. Jerusalem could not be taken, not yet. Despite the disappointment, Richard pressed on, negotiating truces, fortifying castles, and keeping Saladin in constant check. Though the holy city remained beyond his grasp, the Lionheart's resolve burned undimmed. For Richard, the crusade was not merely a quest for land, it was a battle of endurance, faith, and willpower. And as he looked toward the holy city one final time, he swore silently that the Lionheart would never be remembered as a king who abandoned his duty. By the year 1191, King Richard's campaign in the Holy Land had reached its fiercest stage. The Third Crusade was no longer a noble march of knights, but a relentless struggle for survival against the powerful armies of Saladin. Every day tested not only the endurance of Richard's soldiers, but also the will of their king, who had become the very symbol of defiance and courage. After the victory at Arsuf, Richard pressed his forces down the coast, fortifying captured towns and building a line of supply that allowed him to continue the fight. Yet the crown jewel of the crusade remained forever before him. Jerusalem. The holy city, sacred to both Christians and Muslims, was the ultimate prize. To free it from Saladin's control would mark the success of the crusade, and to fail would be remembered as a wound upon Christendom. The march inland was harsh. The desert sun beat mercilessly upon steel helmets, and the cool winds of the coast were left behind. Water grew scarce, and the further the army advanced, the more vulnerable it became to ambush. Saladin, wise and patient, knew that to meet Richard in direct Richard in the Great Hunold. Instead, his men struck like shadows, harassing the Crusaders with arrows, cutting off stragglers, and poisoning wells. The world was acute for help. Through these trials, Richard's leadership shone. He rode among his men not as a distant king, but as a fellow warrior. His red banner, bearing the golden lions of England, was always at the front lines. Chroniclers tell of him eating the same food as common soldiers, even walking beside them when their strength failed. His courage became their strength, his determination their shield. Many whispered that God himself had placed the heart of a lion within his chest. At last, the Crusaders approached Jerusalem. From the hills, the holy city could be glimpsed in the distance, its towers rising from the barren earth like a mirage. Many knights wept at the sight, believing that their long journey had come to an end. But Richard hesitated. He knew the truth that his men could not yet see. The army was exhausted, supplies were stretched thin, and Saladin's forces still encircled the city, ready to crush any assault. To attack Jerusalem now would be to invite disaster. This moment tested Richard's wisdom more than his bravery. A lesser man might have ordered a glorious charge for the sake of honor, even at the cost of annihilation. But Richard chose patience over pride. He ordered a withdrawal to the coast, to strengthen their positions and prepare for another campaign. Many knights grumbled, accusing their king of cowardice. Yet Richard stood firm. He reminded them that victory was not measured by sacrifice alone, but by the preservation of strength for the final blow. As winter fell, the crusade entered a stalemate. Richard fortified Ascalon, a city that secured his hold along the Mediterranean. Saladin, wary of the English king's tenacity, focused on consolidating his defenses. For months, the two greatest warriors of their age stood locked in a contest of wills, testing each other's patience, strategy, and faith. Yet, even in these times of waiting, Richard's legend grew. Songs of his valor spread across Europe, carried by pilgrims and chroniclers. In the Muslim world, too, his reputation soared, not as a barbarian invader, but as a worthy foe, a man of honor and iron will. Saladin himself, though sworn to defeat him, admired the courage of the Lionheart. The crusade was far from over. Both sides prepared for another clash, each knowing that the fate of the Holy Land, and perhaps of history itself, hung upon the choices of two men, Richard, the Lion of the West, and Saladin, the Sword of Islam. Richard the Lionheart's capture in December of the year 1189 was a shocking moment for all of Europe. The King of England, the hero of the Crusades, was now a prisoner. His captor, Duke Leopold of Austria, wasted no time in handing him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. The emperor had no love for Richard, and he saw in this unexpected prize both danger and opportunity. A king in chains could bring him vast wealth or stir up Europe into chaos. Richard was transported across frozen rivers and mountain passes, guarded closely, and eventually brought to Germany. Unlike the stories of knights held in comfortable castles with feasts and music, Richard's imprisonment was harsh. He was kept under constant watch, denied the luxury befitting his royal rank. For a king accustomed to the freedom of battle and the open road, this was a torment. News of his capture spread quickly. In England, the people were stunned. The treasury was already drained from financing the crusade, and now the emperor demanded an enormous ransom, 150,000 marks of silver. To put this into perspective, it was nearly 3 times the annual income of the English crown. Raising such a sum seemed nearly impossible, yet the people were willing to sacrifice everything for their king. Back in Germany, Richard used his wit and charm to survive. Though a prisoner, he refused to be broken. He spoke eloquently, even to his captors, reminding them of the code of honor that bound knights together. His courage and dignity impressed even his enemies. Ballads began to spread, sung by minstrels, about the king who remained defiant in chains. Meanwhile, Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, worked tirelessly to secure his release. She was nearly 70 years old, yet she traveled across England and Normandy, urging nobles, towns, and even monasteries to contribute silver to the ransom. "Your king has fought for Christendom," she declared, "and now Christendom must fight for him." Taxes were raised, church treasures were melted down, and ordinary villagers gave what little they could. The people believed in Richard, not just as their ruler, but as a living symbol of courage. Despite the crushing burden, the English nation united behind their king. But the ransom was not the only obstacle. King Philip of France, once Richard's ally, saw a chance to weaken England. He whispered into Emperor Henry's ear, urging him to keep Richard locked away. Even Richard's own brother, John, hoped that the king would never return. John plotted with Philip, dreaming of seizing the throne for himself. The betrayal of his own blood was perhaps a heavier wound than the chains on his wrists. Through all of this, Richard endured. He spent months in captivity, not knowing if he would ever see his homeland again. Yet, he trusted his mother and his people. "If I must be redeemed with silver," he is said to have told his guards, "then England will shine brighter than gold." By the year 1193, the vast ransom had finally been gathered. Wagon after wagon of silver crossed Europe, a river of wealth flowing to the emperor. The sheer scale of the payment was so great that it became a legend in itself. Never before had a king's worth been measured in such treasure. At last, after more than a year in chains, Richard was released. The gates opened, and the Lionheart stepped out, thinner and wearier, but unbroken. The songs of minstrels echoed once more, celebrating not just his return, but the triumph of loyalty, unity, and hope. Yet Richard knew well, his enemies had not rested during his absence. England had nearly fallen into chaos under John's treachery, and Philip of France was preparing for war. The Lionheart was free, but his struggle was far from over. As the autumn of the year 1192 drew near, Richard's campaigns began to show the strain of endless war. The crusade had tested his endurance, his treasury, and the patience of his allies. Though victories shone brightly in his record, each had come at a terrible cost. The king's health weakened, wounds sustained in battle and the exhausting marches across the Levant left their mark. His once boundless energy grew faint, though his spirit never wavered. The dream of retaking Jerusalem still lingered in his heart, but the reality was cruel. Supplies dwindled, armies shrank, and enemies grew bolder. The negotiations with Saladin brought a fragile truce, one that gave Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City. It denied Richard the triumph he had sought. To some of his men, it felt like defeat. To Richard, it was a bitter compromise, yet perhaps the only possible outcome. When he finally turned homeward, his journey was marked not by glory, but by peril. On his way back to England, fate turned against him. Storms scattered his fleet, and treachery awaited on the roads of Europe. Disguised, he attempted to cross hostile lands, but his presence could not remain hidden. In December of 1192, near Vienna, Richard was captured by Duke Leopold of Austria, an old rival humiliated by the king during the Crusade. The capture of the Lionheart shocked Christendom. To the world, it was unthinkable. The great Crusader king, the champion of the cross, held in chains like a common prisoner. He was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded an enormous ransom for his release. In England, the news brought turmoil. His brother, John, plotted to secure the throne for himself, whispering to nobles and sowing discontent. Yet the people of England, despite their burdens, rallied for their king. Taxes were raised, treasures melted down, and the church itself contributed vast sums to free Richard. The ransom was unprecedented, draining the kingdom's wealth, but it was paid, piece by piece, coin by coin. After more than a year in captivity, Richard was released in February of 1194. His return was celebrated with awe and relief, yet the shadows of betrayal remained. John's treachery could not be forgotten, though Richard, ever pragmatic, forgave his brother to secure unity. There was little time for vengeance. The king's attention turned once more to war. Back in France, Richard resumed his conflict with Philip II of France, his cunning rival who had conspired during his absence. Castles were besieged, towns burned, and armies clashed. Well, Zephyros, views and offers. Though his body bore the weight of years of battle, Richard still fought with the ferocity of the Lionheart. His courage inspired his men, but the endless war bled the land dry. In 1199, fate struck its final blow. While besieging the small fortress of Chalus in Limousin, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt. Though the wounds seemed minor at first, infection set in. As fever consumed him, the once mighty king lay dying. On the 2nd of April, 1199, Richard I of England, called Lionheart, breathed his last. He was 41 years old. At his side was his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who mourned the son who had been both her pride and her sorrow. His heart was buried in Rouen, his body at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father, and his legacy etched into the memory of Europe. It failed to fear alone and bring his hand to joy. Though his reign was marked by war and absence from his kingdom, Richard's name endured. He became the symbol of knightly valor, of courage against all odds, of the eternal struggle for honor and faith. The Lionheart was gone, yet the legend of his roar echoed through the centuries. The year was 1199, and King Richard I of England was still full of restless energy. Though his body bore the marks of countless battles, his spirit remained unbroken. After years spent crusading, negotiating, and waging war in Normandy and Aquitaine, Richard had returned once again to the familiar soil of France. His eyes were set upon reclaiming every stronghold that dared resist his authority. The great monarch, who had crossed continents for glory, was still at heart a warrior who longed for the sound of swords and the smell of fire upon the battlefield. At the center of his attention stood the fortress of Chalus-Chabrol, a relatively small stronghold in Limousin. To most kings, such a place would have been insignificant, hardly worth their time. But Richard was not like most kings. Rumors had reached him that the castle's lord had unearthed a great treasure buried beneath its walls, and whether true or false, Richard would not allow defiance to pass unpunished. He marched upon Chalus with the same resolve he had once carried to Jerusalem. To his knights, this was just another skirmish, a minor siege. To Richard, it was the assertion of his unyielding will, a reminder that no man, great or small, could stand against him. The siege began in the chill of early spring. Richard's men surrounded the castle, building their engines of war, tall siege towers, wooden mantlets, and massive crossbows that could tear through stone walls. The defenders, though few in number, fought fiercely, determined to protect their lord's estate. The air rang with the crack of arrows, the rumble of stones flung from mangonels, and the shouts of warriors on both sides. From his command tent, Richard oversaw every movement, his presence as inspiring as it was intimidating. Soldiers whispered that the Lionheart seemed almost ageless, his fire undimmed despite years of ceaseless war. On the evening of March 26th, as the sun set behind the hills, Richard walked the siege lines with only a few guards. Unlike many kings who would remain safely hidden, he enjoyed watching his men fight, sharing in their hardships, and sometimes even taking up the bow himself. That night he rode close to the walls, perhaps too close, as though daring fate to test him. From the battlements, a lone defender leveled his crossbow. His name, some say, was Pierre Basile, a humble knight, or perhaps even just a mercenary. No chronicler can tell his story with certainty, but on that night, his arrow would change the course of history.